guest speaker today is a pediatric doctor in psychology. She works with people, not just children, but people at any age on diagnosing autism and helping with some of the symptoms that can make life challenging. She's been here in Cleveland, lucky to have her since 2014, and excited to welcome her to the stage for Creative Mornings, Melissa Armstrong-Brine.
Thank you so much. I know some of you met me earlier for my grand entrance, but just to formally introduce myself, I am Melissa Armstrong-Brine. I am the director of the Metro Health Autism and Assessment Clinic here at Metro Health Medical Center. We're actually located in the Parma location most of the time, but we do some work here on main campus now too. And you know, I have to tell you, first I want to just reflect a little bit on this process of kind of preparing for this for you, because I went and I watched some other videos from the past Creative Mornings and went, they look really well put together. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that. All right. So admittedly, this is the first time that I've done something like this in terms of a virtual event. So bear with me. Sometimes I talk fast, sometimes I mumble. I will try not to. I will consciously try not to. And when I was thinking about the topic spectrum, for me, it seems the obvious choice is autism spectrum because that's what I do. But I wanted to force myself to think about what else it might mean, because I think that it's really sometimes nice to draw those comparisons between what other people think, what they might think about. And, you know, my sister is an artist, and I'm pretty sure she would talk to me about the spectrum of light or color and yell at me when I thought that they were the exact same thing, because she tells me they're not really. I also, you know, I asked a colleague and she said, well, I think about gender diversity and the spectrum of gender identity, which I thought was another great answer that I never would have thought of right on my own. And my significant other is a data analyst, and what I think he would have told me drew me back to the autism spectrum, because I think he would have said, are you talking about integers? Is this a program in R you want me to look at? And I would have been like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and I'm gone. So I'm going to stick with the one I know, which is autism spectrum. And I have a lot to say about the autism spectrum, but the first thing I think I want to point out is to remember that it is a spectrum. This is a spectrum we're talking about. And the idea of a spectrum is that we all fall somewhere on that spectrum, but do we fall at that critical cutoff where being on that spectrum means something? So I kind of want to highlight that to begin with. I think that when you're talking about the autism spectrum disorder, it is really important to realize that we're not really talking about one single spectrum. We're actually kind of talking about a constellation of spectrums, because when you get an autism spectrum diagnosis, there are 8 different types of symptoms you can have, and there are many kinds of behaviors that fall into each one of those symptom categories. You have to have a minimum of 5 of the 8 symptoms to get the diagnosis. And I think, hold it, am I right? No, 7 symptoms. I added an extra one in my head because I was thinking about no medical condition. But anyway, so you have to have 5 of the 7 to get the diagnosis. And each one of those symptoms and behaviors falls on a spectrum of itself, from mild, maybe more typical behavior to very atypical behavior. And that means that there are literally infinite combinations of behaviors that can qualify somebody for an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. There is a saying that many in the autism world like to refer to, which is, if you know one individual with autism, you know one individual with autism. And that is entirely true because of the fact that this is a constellation of spectrums. So I first want to make it very clear that when we're talking just even about what I would call an autism spectrum disorder, we are already talking about another spectrum. These are the people that are after that cutoff who qualify for the diagnosis. And really what that cutoff usually is does this cause some kind of impairment in your daily life that is worrisome or concerning to you and somehow makes life more difficult for you in that regard, to the point that you need support or help, okay? We all have difficulties. We all have things that are difficult for us, and we're all unique. And the same is true for individuals with autism spectrum disorders. What I'm going to tell you is that there is this term called neurodiversity. And neurodiversity really refers to the fact that a number of individuals with conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, really feel strongly that these conditions are just a natural variant of genetics and neurological functioning that happens in our population, and that they're things that should be supported and accommodated for, but they're not necessarily things that should be seen as deficits or disorders or difficulties. Because the truth of the matter is, when we look at repetitive behaviors, which is one of the areas of autism, we all have some. It could be I'm tapping my fingers on the table. It could be that I, knock my pen back and forth. It could be that I, secretly squeeze my hands when I get nervous, which is kind of seen as a posturing behavior. We all have some of these. And the truth of the matter is, we all sometimes have difficulty empathizing with other people. We all sometimes have difficulty keeping a social back and forth going. All of us have had relationships that didn't work out for one reason or another, partially because of things that we've done. So the truth of the matter is, we all fall somewhere on these spectrums. It's a matter of, is this causing an impairment? Is it causing a difficulty? The other thing I want to say about this concept of neurodiversity, which is one that I personally love and embrace, and I try to remind parents and individuals I work with about this, is that any of these things that we call disorders don't come without strengths. And that's one of the things that the concept of neurodiversity really wants to focus on, is that while we may have weaknesses in some areas, we have strengths in others. And individuals on the autism spectrum tend to have a lot of strengths that are very beneficial, especially in today's world. And those are things like wonderful mathematics and computer skills, great pattern recognition, which makes them fabulous at coding, just so you know, wonderful ability to separate out the emotion from the logic so that they can make decisions based purely on, at times, purely on what would actually be the right thing for the bottom line, as opposed to that holding that emotional component kind of hostage and not being able to get past that. So there's a lot of wonderful things about being on the autism spectrum. And that's what people in the world of neurodiversity want you to know. I want you to know that there's some fallacies out there that I think have made us really more likely to describe individuals with autism spectrum and people at different places on that spectrum in more of a negative or a deficit sort of way. And those two big fallacies are based in really what we thought about early autism. So Kanner is actually credited in most instances for being the father of the autism diagnosis. And this was in the 1950s that he did this. And there were some other people at the time that also were looking at the diagnosis. So there's a little bit of a question if he should be really called the father, but you get the credit in the book, you get the credit. So he got the credit. And really what he did was he said that there were two big features of autism. One of them was these restricted interests, repetitive behaviors, but the other one was really this idea of autistic aloneness. And so what he saw was that individuals with autism wanted to stay in the corner by themselves. They were completely socially withdrawn, in their own world, not interested in personal contact. And unfortunately, because of that identification, that kind of stereotype has spread into what's now common knowledge, but it's erroneous knowledge, because the truth of the matter is, most individuals who have an autism spectrum disorder want relationships. They can bond with their family. They have a friend that they like. They want to establish strong bonds with people, and they want to be social. They have difficulty because their brain does not process social information the way that a, quote, neurotypical brain does, okay? And just briefly, sorry, an aside to talk about neurotypical. Neurotypical is this idea that there's a way a brain should be wired. I think of it kind of like the leg bones attached to the hip bone sort of thing. There's networks that should connect to other networks and should activate at specific times. depending on what you're doing and looking at. And individuals with autism do not have the same connections. There's a lot of speculation about where those connections lie, but just to throw out a big term here for those who might be interested, the default mode network is one that is actually being looked at. It's one that actually connects the back of your brain where you taking in visual visual stimuli with the amygdala, and the middle of your brain, which is where we process emotion and memories, and the front of your brain, which is where we control our actions to those emotions and situations. So we know that there's differences there. So we also know, though, that those differences don't mean that this individual isn't interested in a social world. It just means that those differences make the social world a little bit more difficult for them to interpret and respond to. And the second thing I want to clarify before I talk a little bit more about autism spectrum is that there really early studies suggested that a very high percentage of individuals with autism spectrum, were also experiencing intellectual disability, okay? And early research said that it was almost 75% of people. And we now know that that was inaccurate information based on a very restricted diagnosis of autism and about the people who most likely showed up for testing and evaluation, okay? We now realize that it's probably more like 25% that have a co-occurring intellectual disability probably at max. And that we need to understand that autism spectrum and intellectual disability or cognitive disability are not the same thing, because I think that's one of the big hangups. When I go to talk to a parent about autism, one of the first things they ask me is, are you telling me my child's slow? Are you telling me my child can't learn? That's not what I'm telling you, and that's not what you're telling somebody you're talking to about autism, because the truth of the matter is those are totally separate things. There is no need to identify intellectual disability to get an autism diagnosis. We do look at it because there are some symptom overlaps sometimes in the lower ends of the spectrum in terms of functioning, but it is not a defining characteristic of autism spectrum disorder. So when I try to dispel those fallacies, the reason I'm really doing that is because I want to talk to you about what to do when you think somebody you care about may be on the autism spectrum. And I know Tom said at the beginning about, how the autism spectrum really it's a developmental disability, but it really goes through the age range, because it's not something that's usually considered to be gone when you're older, all right? I don't like to say cured, because that again implies that there's something wrong with somebody with autism spectrum disorder, and I don't want to subscribe to that thought, because I think that yes, there's some difficulties that they have that they need help getting over and need some accommodations and supports for, but I don't think that I don't think that it's wrong to be on the autism spectrum, okay? Or that it's a disease that needs to be cured. I think it's something that you learn to live with and work around, okay? Just like I learned to work around anxiety or depression. Same thing. So I think that what I want you to know about this is that the first thing you need to do when you identify somebody with autism spectrum is make sure you do your research. What do you know about autism? What are your misbeliefs that are out there? Because there could be a lot, okay? And what is it that you want to say to this person? What are the behaviors that you see specifically that make you think this individual has autism, okay? The second part is, remember that you care about this person, and that's why you want to tell them, okay? And they need to know that. So I think a lot of us who work in the field will tell you that we've had times where we've had to talk to family members about concerns that somebody has autism, and it's really not easier for us. We may have to do a little less research on the front end, but the same emotions and the same complications are involved. And all of us will tell you, and I asked actually my team yesterday, that the first thing to do is to identify to that person that you care about them, and you've noticed that there's some areas where they're struggling, and you're hoping that you can be helpful. Because that's really the thing that matters, is that you're trying to be helpful, right? And then what you want to do is you really want to lay out the behavior or the distress the person is experiencing as the core of your concern, all right? You do not want to talk about things like mental illness because honestly, autism spectrum disorder isn't really considered a mental illness. It's considered a developmental disease that's rooted in, or developmental disorder that's rooted in neurological functioning and differences in neurological functioning. And one of the things I suggest is using that word, different. Have you noticed that sometimes there seems to be something a little bit different? It seems to be really bothering you that you're having trouble building relationships with people, that you don't have as many close friends as other people do. I'm kind of wondering if that's because socially you react to some things a little bit differently. And then you can launch into what I'm talking about is autism spectrum disorder. And for example, when you are in certain situations, I've noticed that you say things that are inappropriate and you don't recognize it right away until somebody gets mad. I'm wondering if that's because you don't understand why that would be inappropriate. And that's okay if you don't, but that's something we can work on. The other thing is to make sure to give them an action step and be willing to help with that action step. So if it's a child you're talking about and you're telling maybe your sister or your cousin that you're worried that their child has autism spectrum disorder, after you've explained why and how you're noticing they're different, maybe, you know, I've really noticed that Sally isn't playing with the other kids like I would expect her to. And it seems like she really spends a lot of time over in the corner kind of looking at her toys rather than really playing with them. I would like to talk to you about that, about what I've noticed and what I think that means. And then refer them to who you think would help them. So for children, most likely the first step is going to be talking to their pediatrician, their primary care physician, whether family medicine or pediatrics. For adults, what you might say is, you know, there's some online groups that are really helpful, and there's a ton of them. Autism Speaks has a link. In Cleveland, we have a local organization called Milestones Autism Resources, which is amazing. Lots of resources on there, lots of information. It's a great place to look. And both sites have a lot of toolkits, and some of them will actually address this issue of how do I tell somebody I think they might have autism. The other thing for adults that you can recommend is that they talk to their primary care physician. What I will tell you is that adult primary care physicians know a little bit less about autism and may kind of brush it off because the individual's been functioning in some capacity in their life well. So you could also seek out a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a counselor, anybody who you think would help this person identify what's going on for them. And then the other thing I want to remind you is that this is a spectrum. So all of these behaviors to some extent could be typical. It is the distress or the impairment that causes them. So that is one of the things you want to impact to this person. I'm not saying that this isn't something other people do too. But what I'm saying is this really seems to be bothering you and interfering with your ability to establish friendships with people. I know that that's hurtful and that that's been really hard for you. I hate to see that because I care about you and I want to help. I think the other thing we really need to think about here is why. Why is the diagnosis important? And what I'm going to tell you is for children, it seems fairly obvious. We want to get them help in school. We want to get them some services. Maybe we think speech language would help them. Maybe we can work on some social skills and help them get involved. But the other thing I think that you need to realize is that a lot of adults with autism have been struggling with things that are associated with it for a long time. When I talk to adults with autism, I often hear things like, I've never felt like I fit in. Nobody understands me. I don't feel like I understand other people. I've always had difficulties at work. I never get along with my coworkers, and it's really bothering me. I don't understand why. I was just telling them the truth. I was just being honest. Sometimes individuals with autism get really rule-bound, and that causes a lot of problems, especially when they correct other people's behavior or make statements that might come across as being judgmental, but are really just meant to outline, hey, look, this is what I think is the right thing to do. So a lot of them have had difficulties learning how to interact with various people and have always felt kind of shut out. In addition, some of those behaviors, sensory behaviors, not liking the feel of water or certain textures, liking to look at certain lights or feeling the need, the sensations in your body to jump or flap your hands, have been interfering for them because they know that those behaviors are not socially acceptable, but they still feel like they need to do them, and have been trying to integrate those things into their life. So when I give an adult a diagnosis of autism, I'm not always giving them something that's going to get them great support services and help. What I'm giving them is a piece of their identity, a place to feel safe and to know that this is something that's been going on for them and has impacted their life in these specific ways. For a lot of people, that's huge because they've been blaming themselves for years for not getting along with people. What do I do wrong? Maybe they've at times come across to other people as a little paranoid because they say, I'm not going to that social event because everybody's going to hate me, or I'm not doing that because I know that nobody's going to like me. But they have lived in this existence where they haven't felt like their identity is complete or that they understand why these difficulties are theirs. And the diagnosis gives them a context to put that in. It's likely not going to get them extra SSI. It's not likely to get them speech language therapy when they're 56, but it is going to give them some inner peace. And let's be honest, inner peace is the most important step to mental health, because unless you can be satisfied with what's going on internally for you and know who you are, it's really hard to get to that place where you can be comfortable in your own skin and feel like you're healthy. And really, that's my wish for everybody I see, my kids and my adults and the parents, is inner peace. I'm not telling you that there's something wrong that needs to be the scarlet letter on your chest. I'm telling you that there's some things we can do to help in these situations that might be distressing to you and your child, and that there are some individuals who really need to know what's going on for them in order to feel like they understand themselves. And I know that when you're in that moment and you're hearing the diagnosis from my lips and you're worrying about the future of your child or your future, or what friends are going to think, or how this individual is going to be able to function on their own, that it's really hard to know that that's what the intention is or that you can get there. But I promise you that most of us who work in the field really want you to know that we accept you for who you are, and we think that other people can too. Thank you, everybody.